Alright guys, welcome back to the Pocket Mads channel. It's Maddie here. Today we're going to break down the best decks for this new ranked season. That's right, the ranked mode is out. It's one of those things where, you know, the season goes on for like a couple of weeks and the metagame develops and then ranked releases, and then it's sort of this like fast rush where we get like 2 weeks of the ranked season. This season in particular of Pulsing Aura is a little bit crazy because there are so many strong decks and it's hard to get a real read on the metagame. I do think that ranked is something that we can look at as like a translation of the tournament metagame. Like I think some people debate that. At the end of the day, the number one thing that we have available to us is the data from all of the online tournaments, because that's literally all we have. It's the best thing to base things off of. So I have reviewed the metagame. I have kept you guys updated for the last couple of weeks. And at this point, it's safe to say that we understand what the most popular decks are in the meta and what the best decks are. So that's what we're going to kind of talk about today. There is some interesting stuff that happened this week in terms of decks that are doing well. We'll talk about that at the end of the video for the weekly wildcard. But before we get into it, don't forget to like and subscribe. And also don't forget to register for PMPT number 31, which is this upcoming weekend. It's actually tomorrow, Saturday at noontime. Definitely register. We will be live streaming it this weekend. It's going to be very exciting. But that being said, guys, let's dive right into the deck lists. The first one is going to be Sceptile. So the interesting thing about Sceptile is that its performance throughout the season isn't anything super exceptional, other than the fact that it did win the 2 largest tournaments so far this season, which is kind of hilarious. Now, I do think that Sceptile benefits from a couple of different things. One, it's a very consistent deck, and 2, it's strong typing, right? The grass typing is really good into certain decks that are certainly going to be somewhat popular on the rank ladder, things like Zoroark, things like Hydreigon. You're definitely going to see those decks on the rank ladder to some extent. Into things like Suicune and the lightning type decks, you're also going to be kind of covered there. The iffy part about Sceptile is into some of the other matchups, like of course Lucario, Altaria, Blaziken. Those are other things that are seeing some play, even Charizard. If you run into those types of decks on the ranked ladder, things might be a little bit more difficult. But I still believe in Sceptile as a really decent choice going into this ranked season. It's not something that necessarily I would choose, mainly just because I don't think the overall like power level for Sceptile is like as high as some of the other decks out there. I think Sceptile does well in the sense that it's consistent and you kind of know what you're getting with it, but its upside isn't nearly as high as some of the other decks. So when you're playing this on the ranked ladder, you might feel like you're just losing because your deck isn't strong enough. And if you do kind of feel that to be happening a lot, then maybe kind of move to a more high roll, you know, top end heavy deck list. But I really do like Sceptile. I still think Ogerpon is a really great choice. There's certainly going to be a lot of sleep decks with Igglybuff and Darkrai on the ranked ladder, so I would heavily suggest you do play Ogerpon. And I know that Kartana is a really valuable leadoff Pokemon into things like Hydreigon and Zoroark, but in general, I do think Pheromosa is a little bit better. And most of the Sceptile decks that are seeing play and success in online tournaments recently have been sort of a mixed version of the deck list. 1 Leaf Cape, 1 Rocky Helmet, 1 May, 1 Copycat. So a little bit of everything, right? 1 Rare Candy and then 1 Grovyle helps for protection from Chingling item lock and not being able to Rare Candy into your Sceptile. Either way, Fragrant Forest is a massive buff, and I think a lot of grass decks have a lot of potential. Sceptile is still, I think, the number 1 example right now. If you wanted to kind of reach a little bit, you could play things like Meowscarada. But at the end of the day, I actually really like Sceptile, and I wanted to recommend it. It's got to be one of our top 7 or 8 decks for ranked battles right now, even though it might not be my number 1 choice, which is interesting, right? Because it did get first place at both tournaments that we've run so far this season. But we'll see how it performs. If it wins for a 3rd week in a row, then that's in general pretty crazy. So we'll see if that happens, but I guess you never really know. Next up, let's talk about Zoroark. Zoroark is actually kind of my favorite new deck. I think this deck list has a lot going for it. I think that it's super consistent and has a lot of power early in games. I think that being consistent and then also being aggressive, being like an early game deck list, is a really big advantage in ranked battles because you don't really want to deal with your deck bogging down and being super inconsistent or being stopped by things like, you know, item lock Chingling or, you know, other things that could kind of disrupt your deck list. And Zoroark does that very, very well. Overall this season, one of the more successful decks. I think that this season brought 3 really strong decks, being Lucario, Zoroark, and Sceptile, and they're all really different. They kind of fill different niches, and I kind of do recommend all 3 of them right now, because from a power level perspective and or a consistency perspective, they're all really good decks. Lucario does a ton of damage. It's extremely powerful. Sceptile is a nice sort of tempo, you know, mid-range deck. And then we have Zoroark, which is really aggressive and fast pacing in the early game. What's nice about Zoroark, conveniently, is that it's how do I explain it? It's one of the only 2 prize Pokemon decks in the game. right? Like, so oftentimes in this metagame, if you're playing ranked or in tournaments, you'll notice that, you know, it's kind of mega Pokemon on mega Pokemon. And if your mega Pokemon gets KO'd, or if you don't draw well, or if you can't evolve it, then you end up losing the game. But Zoroark kind of breaks free from that, you know, similar to how Suicune was in the last few seasons. Zoroark really fills that niche of, you know, having multiple 2-prize Pokemon with decent amounts of HP that, you know, most Pokemon can't really want to KO that easily, right? And I think it lends itself really well. We have Mega Absol in here. Bombardier is a great addition to these Dark-type decks. Even Hydreigon runs it. One Sabrina, one Cyrus, PCL, Giant Capes, Rocky Helmets, Copycat Researches, and Pokeballs. Like, the deck has, like, a little bit of everything. So I do recommend Zoroark. However, I also do recommend Hydreigon, and we'll talk about it in this video. I would say that I don't have a clear preference from one or the other. It really just depends on, I think, your preference when it comes to how you want to be playing, you know, these ranked battles, right? If you're going to be playing a ton of games, would you rather just sort of be on like the dice roll simulator, playing things like Hydreigon and hoping that you just high roll your opponent? Or would you rather play a deck that's a lot more consistent, a lot more engaging in the early game, and you know, potentially not as strong in the late game, right? That's sort of where Zoroark, you know, finds its niche. But I typically enjoy early game decks like this because, you know, a lot of times decks, especially like the top decks in the metagame of the last few seasons, are a little bit dependent on like turn 3 and turn 4. So if your opponent doesn't really reach the board state that they want to, you know, on that particular turn 3 or turn 4, then Zoroark's probably just going to run away with games. It's a really, really great deck, really consistent, and I think it's going to be great. I think this is a great deck for playing a ton of games. Like, if you're really grinding the rank ladder, Zoroark would be a pretty high recommendation for me. And let's talk about updated Hydreigon next up, because I still think Hydreigon's got to be a really good choice for the ranked ladder. I think that at the end of the day, you either play a really consistent deck that you know what you're getting every game, or you're just playing like high roll with Lucky Ice Pops and things like Hydreigon, and this is still like the #1 example of that. Even like the stronger late game decks aren't necessarily high roll type decks like Lucario, and even things like Charizard. Like, they're actually pretty consistent decks. They're just late game decks. The thing about Hydreigon is that, sure, it's always strong in the late game, but sometimes it's strong in the early game. We have Lucky Ice Pops, coin flips, you know, rare candy, turn 2 shenanigans. We all know what Hydreigon does. It's a deck list that I'm really not fond of in terms of me playing it personally, because like I said, I do prefer the more consistent, you know, fast-paced decks, but you know, high roll certainly always going to be good. The problem is, if I play Hydreigon on the rank ladder, I'm just never going to draw what I need to draw. And also, the current build for Hydreigon right now is pretty susceptible to Chingling. And I think that the best decks to play right now, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, are going to be kind of consistent decks that can utilize strategies like that. Nothing else to really say about Hydreigon. Its performance so far this season has been pretty good. You know, like, we can't sleep on it. I think now there's just so many other strong options that it's not necessarily like a super top tier 0 deck in the current metagame, but I still think Hydreigon is a top tier deck, guys. Like, I mean, I think, you know, if you're especially in ranked, like, the thing about Hydreigon is it doesn't really have a lot of terrible matchups. Like, even with the inclusion of Sceptile and Zoroark, which do pretty well into Hydreigon realistically, and those are 2 new decks that we didn't have in previous seasons, but you know, realistically, if you're playing against like all of the legacy decks or Altarias and Lucarios, Hydreigon's totally fine with all of that. You know what I mean? Any mega deck, Hydreigon's going to do pretty well into, as long as it's not like grass and hitting our Pokemon for weakness. So I still recommend it. I do. I know it's not something that I would choose to play, but you know, high roll, Lucky Ice Pop, Hydreigon's always going to be a good choice on the ranked ladder. So there you go. And let's talk about Suicune. You know, Suicune really, really dipped hard early in the season. It looked like Suicune would be like pretty much irrelevant throughout the season, but it's been coming back slowly and slowly. More and more people are playing it in tournaments. I know that there's going to be people playing Suicune on the ranked ladder because it's still one of those standard like default decks in Pokemon Pocket. Like, people still, like, when they're queuing up, they might not have opened the new pack. You know what I mean? Like, you never really know. And people know Suicune. They know how to play it. They feel comfortable with it. It is a very consistent Pokemon. So you're probably going to see a decent amount of Suicune on the ranked ladder. And that's because it's a pretty good choice, honestly. If you notice that you're seeing a lot of Hydreigon on the ranked ladder or things like Blaziken and Fire decks, Suicune's a really great choice because, again, some of the more popular decks in the game are those Fire-type decks and Hydreigon, and Suicune actually does well into both of those matchups, which is a very unique place to be in. Now, considering everything else that's popular in the metagame, like fighting and lightning and whatnot, you know, Suicune might not be that great. So I think the matchups are very suspect for Suicune this season, more than they have been in previous seasons, but still a very consistent deck, still a strong deck, and at the end of the day, like, people are going to play what they feel comfortable with, and, you know, as long as you feel comfortable with the mirror matchup and whatnot, you're probably going to be totally fine. We're seeing more Field Blower in these deck lists, by the way. A lot of people playing at least one copy of Field Blower. It does have a lot of applications. I think people are finally realizing the use of Field Blower. Not only does like every deck play a Stadium, but every deck plays tool cards. Like there really is no reason to not play a Field Blower in your deck list because it will provide value at some point. So it should be like the 19th, 20th card in your deck. You're probably noticing that throughout these deck lists that we're highlighting in today's video. But yeah, shout out to Suicune. I mean, I got nothing else to say about it. Definitely still a good choice, you know, a safe choice. Next up, let's talk about Lucario because there are a couple of Lucario decks that I think are quite good. You could play Sleep Lucario, but quite frankly, I'm not even going to sit here and suggest that you do play Bad Dreams on the ranked ladder just because I don't feel that comfortably that that's something that's going to even do that well for you. Maybe people aren't counterplaying Sleep, like maybe you don't, you know, your opponents aren't playing a lot of PCLs or Ogre Pawns or whatnot. But, you know, Bad Dreams, Sleep Lucario, still a top tier deck. I'm not going to include it in today's video because I do kind of would rather, I would rather promote this version of Lucario, which is what I'm calling like the ethical Mega Lucario deck because it is a really strong deck and it is a bit straightforward, which I think is typically good. You know what I mean? So Hitmontop as the lead, we got Shaman for retreat support, you know, bench damage, and then we set up Mega Lucario and we kind of just sweep through your opponent. The upside to Mega Lucario, of course, and honestly, if I were to play a deck on the ranked ladder, this would be extremely high up on my list of choices because you got to think if you're queuing into things like, you know, other Lucarios, of course, but if you're queuing into Altarias, you're gonna do somewhat well with Lucario because you have the potential to one-hit KO Pokemon, and that's a really big upside here. Like the amount of reach that Lucario has to KO other Mega Pokemon, even Stage 2 Megas with the Hitmonlee damage and Arena of Antiquity and Karina, Lucario can do something that not many decks in the game can do, aside from something like maybe Charizard, but as we know, Charizard has a lot of inconsistencies and it's a little bit slow, and you also kind of pair it with like two prize Pokemon. There's a lot of scenarios where the prize math doesn't really work with Charizard. Lucario doesn't actually have that issue, not nearly as bad, right? Like, Hitmontop is such a great Pokemon because it's just going to deal a little bit of chip damage, and it's probably going to survive for a couple of turns. We can bring in Lucario, even if we only have 2 energies on Lucario, we might be able to take a KO anyway with all of the extra damage boosting that we have in the deck list. You know, Protective Poncho is going to be really, really nice for, you know, the mirror matchups or into Pheromosa Sceptile or into Suicune Qianpao. So Protective Poncho is super good, and I think more decks probably should be playing it right now. But yeah, Lucario is, in my mind, probably like the strongest deck in the game. Like, I know it hasn't won one of our tournaments, but it's won a lot of other tournaments, and its win rate is consistently amongst the top week after week. So I really feel strongly that Lucario is going to be a strong choice. And it's kind of got, like, it's got everything, you know what I mean? Like, it's interesting because this season, it really feels like certain archetypes got a little bit more defined, like well-defined in terms of their uniqueness, right? Like the fighting archetype and the fighting type in general in Pocket got things like Arena of Antiquity and Karina. So fighting Pokemon are kind of known now for dealing a little bit more damage than everything else. You know, as we know, like Steel type Pokemon have damage reduction, Grass type Pokemon have like extra HP, but also, you know, consistency in terms of, you know, populating your board full of Pokemon with, you know, the new with the new Stadium, Fragrant Forest, and then of course they have Quick Growth Extract. So like, and Fire, of course, has Flame Patch. So like, they've slowly become, or the Pokemon Pocket developers are like slowly becoming a little bit more concrete in their definitions of the types, which is really good because I think every type, even though a lot of the decks are similar in their core build, like have, you know, certain aspects to them that are unique, right? And I think that Grass has been buffed tremendously because of the new Stadium, but Fighting is exceptionally good now because it just feels like these fighting decks and these fighting Pokemon are able to deal a little bit more damage than everything else, which is, you know, inherently, I guess, you know, what fighting type decks are now, which is a really big upside. Like, at the end of the day, you know, there's so many different things. You can item lock, you can, you know, do bench damage, you can do all this different stuff. You can have extra HP, you can do healing. There's all of these things that go into, you know, creating a strong deck. But at the end of the day, dealing a lot of damage is going to be the most useful thing, right? Like, being able to KO your opponent's Pokemon is how you win games. So I think that's why Lucario, although very straightforward in its approach, is definitely still one of the better decks in the game right now and something that I have to recommend. Next up, let's talk about Altaria, because Altaria is incredibly interesting. We're going to highlight Gourgiest Altaria. This is definitely, I think, the most successful deck over the last week, maybe even 2 weeks in terms of average win rate. And I think it kind of comes down to not only are we hitting a lot of these fighting type Pokemon for weakness, Gourgeist can one-hit KO Hitmontop, and we are hitting Lucarios for weaknesses, but we can deal with Oricorio quite easily, and we're an extremely consistent deck, which is kind of where Altaria falls. You know, I think Altaria does best as sort of this toolbox deck where you have all these different psychic Pokemon that do different things, and you can kind of fill whatever purpose you need to for that given game. It's just incredibly flexible. That's what Altaria is really all about. We have 2 different Altaria decks in here because I do think you could play it, extremely consistently, like we're playing here with Gourgiest with a ton of different options, or you could play high roll like we're going to see later with Greninja, but I really like this deck. I love Jirachi in here for the bench damage, Mellow Edit to pull Pokemon out of our deck list. We also have Comfey to protect us from status conditions, which is also going to be a really big deal. 3 different stadiums in this deck list, which I actually think is pretty cool. Peculiar Plaza is really important because the ability to have free retreat on like all our Pokemon is a really big deal for consistency, but then also the training arena. So you're like, why do we really need 3 stadiums? But what it's doing is it's allowing you to have stadium control. So this deck list in particular, which I really like, is not even playing any tool cards. You're just playing extra stadiums. That way you always have whatever stadium you want in play and your opponent doesn't. And that's always going to be a really big deal, especially into, those fighting type decks and grass type decks. So I really like Altaria. Also can still benefit from Lycia, and any deck that benefits from Lycia is going to be a little bit more consistent than everything else. And it's also one of those things that Altaria can do. You also have Sleep Swablu. So at the end of the day, if you needed to buy yourself a turn, Altaria can do that. And it's a kind of a unique thing that no other Mega Pokemon can do. But yeah, I feel strongly that Gourgeist Altaria is still a top deck. And it's probably like the #1 deck in terms of like overall consistency and flexibility. That's why its average win rate is so high, even though it hasn't necessarily won that many tournaments. On ranked ladder, playing an incredibly consistent deck is going to feel good because you have just a higher probability of winning the game no matter what you match up into, and I think Altaria does that quite well. Also, not really any steel type decks seeing play, so that's a big upside. Next up is Greninja Altaria, which coincidentally is like one of the only decks playing Chingling right now. Dark Greninja plays Chingling. You could play Chingling in this type of Altaria deck list as well, so keep that in mind. But yeah, anything with Chingling I think also is an incredibly strong choice. High roll Altaria now with Greninja is still a top tier deck list. It's still performing extremely well in online competitions. Now the draw power has been increased, like we said in previous highlights with Lucky Egg. But at the end of the day, it's Chingling item lock, and that is like the biggest thing I think right now. No matter what you're going up against, being able to kind of get that jingling noise attack off early, perhaps on turn 1, if your opponent doesn't have a real way to like deal with Chingling early on, like they probably are just going to lose to it. Or the probability of you losing or winning because of Chingling is higher than just not having Chingling. You know what I mean? People always laugh because I always like gas up Chingling like every season. But it's no surprise that every season there's like a top tier deck that plays Chingling, and people always underrate it, I think, right now. And yeah, I mean, as we know, Greninja Altaria is incredible because you have the potential to deal a ton of damage with the Cyrus Wind condition. I still think this is a top tier deck in the game right now. Kind of my #1, like kind of high roll type of deck. You know what I mean? Even though it's like not so much high roll because of Lucky Egg anymore, I would rather play this than Hydreigon, but they're both really high up in the, I guess, in the rankings. Greninja's an interesting one because like we've seen Greninja with Blaziken do well at a tournament. We've seen Greninja Lucario, Greninja Suicune still exists, but like Greninja Altaria is still like the #1 deck. And at the end of the day, Greninja's broken, so it's always going to be probably relevant unless something just really drastic happens. Yeah, I do think Greninja Altaria has to be an extremely strong choice. All right, now let's get into the weekly wildcard before we wrap up today's video. This is going to be a deck from Froggy X Arca that I think got first place at a recent tournament, and I really like it, and I think that it's actually a pretty strong illustration of things that can happen. And you'll notice that in today's video, we didn't highlight any lightning type decks. Now, it's interesting because I never feel that confident about Oricorio on the ranked ladder, but at the end of the day, if you wanted to play Oricorio, you're probably going to be pretty successful as long as like you kind of, know what's going on with the Oricorio stuff. We've seen some interesting Oricorio decks. We've seen Manectric with Oricorio. We've seen Magnezone Oricorio. There was an 18 trainer Oricorio deck that placed well recently at a couple tournaments, which is a crazy deck list. That's more of a tournament meta call type thing. But for ranked battles, here is our weekly wildcard, which is going to be Greninja Oricorio and then one Giratina thrown in there, Mesagosa in the deck list. I actually think Greninja Oricorio is an extremely strong choice. When you take a look at the metagame right now, you start to understand that sure, you might be going up against those like Hitmontop leads, but in most games, your opponent's just trying to get into an EX Pokemon and then, you know, set up and win. And if they don't have a clear way to get Oricorio just out of there and dealt with, they're just not actually really able to win games. And like the thing about Greninja Oricorio is that you're able to put a ton of more pressure on your opponent with Greninjas than you would be just with Oricorio and like something else, right? So you can keep Oricorio in the active while also dealing that additional damage, bench damage, Cyrus win condition. You know, we have PCL in the deck list, double giant capes as well, and then the Giratina thrown in. And I think this Giratina is actually a really big deal because, again, if the game does get slowed down, and this is super smart because Giratina hits for 130 damage. And you don't have to play, like, this is a deck that probably is playing water and lightning energy, or you could just play lightning energy, but I assume it's probably dual energy, so you could attack with Greninja if you wanted to. But at the end of the day, Giratina generates its own lightning energy. So if the game slows down, we park an Oricorio in the active, we're drawing cards, getting into Greninja. By the time the game's at its final board state, your opponent has to be wary of that 130 damage attack from Giratina that is probably going to come down at some point. It's just another reason to fear this deck list, especially that 130 plus some Greninjas is 150, 170 damage. Like, that's going to end up camming like a Mega Pokemon if they already have some damage onto it. It's a really solid win condition at the end of the game, one that I think is super underrated. A very, very kind of legacy deck. This isn't like an old strategy, but I actually think it's really, really smart right now. And Froggy X Arca brought this to a tournament and just dominated because nobody was really accounting for the Oricorio Greninja combo as well as the Giratina, you know, damage win condition. So I think it's really cool. A really great deck list. So that's going to be our weekly wild card for today's video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, guys, and don't forget to register for PMPT number 31, which is this weekend. It is Saturday tomorrow at noontime. Definitely register. Tune into the live stream this weekend. This was a shorter video, but again, we've talked about most of these decks already, so I didn't want to ramble too much. And these are kind of my recommendations right now, along with the wild card. Nothing too crazy. I think that this metagame is pretty well defined. Again, there's a lot of decks we didn't talk about in today's video. That doesn't mean they're not good. Understand, we talked about, I think, 7 or 8 decks in this video. There's probably 7 or 8 other decks that are also really strong choices. And if it's working for you, comment it down below, let us know, you know, definitely share your experience. Because, you know, like, at this point, I'm not going to sit here and showcase 20 different decks, but there's probably that many decks that are going to be successful for you on the ranked ladder. But anyway, guys, there we go. That's the video. Peace out. Have a good one. We'll see you guys later. And yeah. Bye.